Thank you, David. And I mean, I'm absolutely delighted that Francis Fitzgerald, the Taoiseach and Minister of Justice, is here with us this morning. And the Minister appreciates this is a particularly busy day for you with all the political activity that's going on. I mean, since when the Taoiseach was Minister for Children, she launched our report many years ago. And I really appreciated the way that, when she was developing the very important Children First Bill, that she was so open to consulting the agencies that were working with survivors of sexual abuse at the time, and now that she's steering two really crucial pieces of legislation through the Dáil, the Sexual Offences Bill and the Victims' Rights Bill, again she is so open to engaging with us and drawing from the experience in the sector. So Minister, thank you, I really do appreciate that. So just to give you sort of an overview of what we've been doing this year, our advocacy team work with men and women who've been sexually abused, supporting them to make child protection notifications to TUSLA, to engage with the Garda Síochána in making complaints, and also in civil processes. They worked with 663 people last year, so a very, very busy service indeed. In general, 1 in 4 is often associated with clerical abuse, but what we've seen is a drop in clerical survivors and a growth in the number of people who have been sexually abused in their own family. As you can see there, last year, over 31% of people who contacted advocacy were abused. This creates particular difficulties. We operate a mandatory reporting system in 1 in 4, so everybody who comes to us and tells us about sexual abuse, we notify TUSLA Child Protection about that. Obviously, for people who've been abused by a close family member, that causes great anxiety about what's going to happen, what the fallout will be, often with very valid fears that they'll be ostracised and disbelieved by their family. So it is really so important that they would have that expert support. If we look at the type of support that was offered, many people were interested in the criminal justice system, but again we have found that people are absolutely terrified of what's going to happen. We've had very good experience with the Gardaí in the main, although unfortunately we did have to support a number of clients last year to make complaints to GSOC about ways in which investigations were carried out inappropriately. But in the main, the Gardaí provide a very professional, very sensitive service to victims of sexual crime, and we very much welcome the changes that have been taking place, especially the opening of victim support offices right around the country in the Gardaí, and their current training programme for sensitive investigations such as sexual crimes. The real problem is in the court system, and if we go on, if we go on, we supported 54 people to attend court last year, and almost without exception, our clients were demeaned, humiliated, re-traumatised by the protocols and processes that pertain in a criminal trial. So to the point that being a complainant witness in a criminal trial holds immense terror for victims of sexual crime. And I am really pleased with some of the provisions in the new Sex Offences Bill. For example, changes in the way counselling notes can be introduced, very private notes can be introduced into court, the way that pre-trial hearings will be used to deal with legal issues before the case actually begins. I would urge a number of other changes. One, under Irish law, the person against whom the allegation has been made, the alleged perpetrator, has the right to cross-examine a witness. I find that absolutely unspeakable and believe that should be changed as it has been in other jurisdictions. I also really would welcome if the Minister would consider extending the right to be cross-examined through remote TV camera to adult victims as well as to children, as is very welcome in the bill. As you can see, even though we're Dublin based, the advocacy service is so specialised that huge numbers of people travel from all over the country to that service. In terms of psychotherapy, we offer counselling to men and women who've been sexually abused, and last year we worked with 115 people. And as you can see, as always, we are so glad that so many men feel free to come to 1 in 4. That wouldn't be true of many of the other sexual violence services, which are perhaps seen publicly as especially for women. So we do welcome that very much. In terms of the age range, typically the age clumps between sort of 30 and 60, although we have seen an increasing number of younger men and women coming to us in the 18 to 29 age range. We don't work with people under 18. As you can see, again, the number of people who've been sexually abused in their own family is increasing all the time. So this year, 39%, almost 40% of the people who came to us had been abused in their own family. And if we look at the breakdown of those, for people abused outside the family, again, we still have quite a few clerical abuse survivors, but then the other people abused by family, friends, neighbours, and about 15% by strangers. In terms of interfamilial abuse, you can see right across the range very close family members, fathers, stepfathers, grandfathers, brothers, uncles, and a small percentage of people who were abused by a female relative, which is only 3% last year, which is probably lower than the international research would suggest. But again, I think it could be particularly difficult for people to disclose sexual abuse by, for example, their mother. It just seems to be so out of anything that we might imagine that people find it very hard to disclose that. And again, the impact of sexual abuse is such that it requires often quite long-term therapy. On average, our clients will be with us somewhere between 2 to 3 years in individual or group therapy. We do have a number of people who've been with us for significantly longer periods of time. Very often they're people, for example, who are engaged in the criminal justice system, and because cases can take so long to come to court, need that extra support. And again, obviously when people have to come for counselling every week, it's very hard to travel. But again, a significant number of people actually do travel from all over the country because they recognise the very expert support they're going to get in 1-4. We also have a growing area of our work is working with the families of the survivors, especially when there's been a disclosure of abuse in the family. It's like a bombshell is going off. And very often families will react by absolutely denying what the victim has said, ostracising the victim, disbelieving the victim, and actually supporting the offender. So all the family members, the non-offending family members, also need support to consider what has happened, to look at the family dynamic, and to create a family situation where other children are going to be safe. And that brings me on, and we delivered over 2,500 psychotherapy hours last year. This brings me on to the area of our work that is growing most and where perhaps there is the greatest need, and that is the Phoenix programme, which is our sex offender intervention programme. Last year we worked with 38 sex offenders, which was up from the previous year. These are mainly people who would never be convicted of their crime, partly because their victims do not wish to make a statement to the Gardaí. About a third of those men actually were subject to a Garda investigation, and in fact 3 or 4 of them did receive custodial sentences during 2015. But this highlights for me the absolute need to provide services for non-convicted sex offenders, and I know I've spoken to the Tánaiste about this before. As we'll see, I'll just maybe go through. A growing age group of the sex offenders is the young men, the 18 to 25-year-olds. And for the first time at the moment, we have 2 treatment groups running. These are young men who, again, out of the face, began their journey into offending through internet, downloading images of child abuse on the internet, often at around puberty, becoming sexualised to those images, and then going on to contact abuse. I think this is an area that is like a big train coming down the tracks at us as a society. And my heart actually goes out to those young men traipsing in every week. Some of them students, some of them apprentices, some of them unemployed. At the very beginning of their lives, they have caused such devastation, but now also for the rest of their lives will require management and supervision. For example, one young man who had to have his girlfriend in and her parents to explain what he has done and what the issues are going to be if they decide to go on and start a family. So huge implications there. Again, people are coming from all over the country. In the past year we've had a man coming from West Kerry, we've had people coming from Midwest, Limerick, Mayo, Sligo, And this really highlights for me the absolute need to have this type of programme, probably in every county in the country, but certainly in all the major cities around the country, and that just is not available at the moment. And if we consider that a sex offender can typically go on to abuse 50 kids over the course of an abusing life, if we consider that probably fewer than 5% of sex offenders are ever convicted, without these types of programmes, huge numbers of children are placed at risk. Again, if we look at the type of offending, in extrafamilial offending, about some of them had abused a child they knew, but a large number had actually abused an unknown child, a stranger. And then about 43% of them had abused somebody within their own family. Over 20% were with us because often they had been caught by the Gardaí downloading images of child sexual abuse. We don't use the term child pornography because that implies some sort of validity to it. It is downloading images of watching children being sexually abused. And sometimes child protection social workers, for example, don't actually get the seriousness of that because they haven't actually committed a contact offence. The reality is that if they're watching these images, a real child somewhere is being abused. And also most of our offenders will tell us that when they were caught, the next step for them would have been to commit a contact offence. So it is really a huge child protection issue. And there we just have the number of children that each offender abused as when we first met them. And usually we'll hear some of the story at the beginning, and then the rest of the story will emerge over the course of 2-year treatment. I should stress that even if these offenders are not convicted, as soon as they contact us, we contact child protection social workers in Tusla, but we also contact the superintendent, Garda, in the area in which the offenders live. And it is impossible for a small NGO with no statutory powers to manage these guys, and we absolutely need to work in a very collaborative way with the statutory agencies on this matter. The other, I suppose, really core aspect of child protection is working with the wives and partners of the offenders, and last year 19 engaged with us. And we're actually very grateful to HFC Ireland and to the Catherine Howard Foundation, who part-funded some of this work. We find when the women come to us, they generally are in denial about what their husband has done, or indeed are actively blaming the children for what has happened. I quoted in our press release this morning, we had one woman who told us that her 11-year-old daughter was a slut because she had taken her husband away from her. We find a lot of these women are highly dependent on their husband, psychologically, emotionally, financially, and over the course of the 2-year programme they do with us, they do come to realise how manipulated they've been by the offender, and they come to a place where they recognise that they really do have a responsibility as an adult to protect their children from further harm. They will engage with Tusla child protection social workers and put in place a child safety plan so that we can be fairly confident going forward that the children of these mothers and other children in the extended family will actually not be sexually abused. Now, restorative justice, I quote here from a piece of research some of our advocacy officers conducted about our clients who actually did go through the criminal justice system. Everybody was talking about me as if I was brainless. I just couldn't go up there and give my evidence again. It was horrific, the most awful thing. I just think it was a barbaric system. I could have walked out of the court and jumped in the living and they would not have felt 1 ounce of guilt. So these are complainant witnesses, in most cases where there was a conviction, where the person was found guilty, and this is how they experienced the criminal trial. Because of this, a number of years ago, all the staff in 1 and 4 were trained in restorative practices, restorative justice practices, where the experience of the victim is placed absolutely at the centre of the process, where they have the opportunity to talk about the impact the abuse has had on them, the harm that has been caused, and what they need going forward. So in 2015, we worked with 6 cases. 2 of them involved perpetrators and victims. That was when the perpetrator had actually completed a treatment programme and was genuinely remorseful and understanding of what they had done. It's a very delicate area there. The others were with the families, the fallout in the families, where the victim, for example, had been ostracised by the family, and where we were able to work with family members and bring people together to have a conversation about what was happening and what needed to happen going forward, again, protecting children. So we're very grateful to the Ireland funds who supported some of our work in this area last year. When it comes to policy and influencing, I feel like every year I stand up here and in fact we're looking at the same issues over and over again. But I would say that 2015 was actually a very good year for victims. The Children First Act was finally enacted, although we really would call on the Minister for Children, the current Minister for Children, to speed up its commencement. It seems to be operating at an absolute snail's pace. It looks like it'll be 5 or 6 years before it's fully implemented. This will create the obligation on professionals to report any concerns they have about children to TUSLA social workers. But that of course means that they have to, that TUSLA needs to be properly resourced to deal with the increase in notifications. Now in 2015, we made 49 notifications to TUSLA child protection social workers. They were all what is called retrospective allegations. And we are concerned that most of those came back with the designation of being unfounded. In other words, there wasn't enough evidence to pursue or investigate further. Now we do appreciate the challenges that are there for social workers in investigating allegations of child sexual abuse, particularly those that took place in the past. But we are very concerned that when, with our support, people take that step, will speak to a social worker, and then nothing happens. And undoubtedly, children are at risk. These are very credible allegations. So I'm not sure what needs to happen in truth, but in some ways, reporting to the Gardaí is a much safer and more effective option in terms of child protection. In terms of the criminal justice system, I've mentioned the experience of our clients in court, and we really do welcome the new sexual offences bill. I think that is going to make a difference. One of the things that we find abhorrent is that, for example, counselling notes can be made available to the defence, very personal things that will be discussed confidentially in counselling can then come into the public domain. We have worked with DPP to put some limitations on that, but we do welcome the provision that these notes perhaps will be viewed by the judge who will make decisions about disclosure. The other area that continues to concern us is the fallout from the Louise O'Keeffe case. You may remember Louise was sexually abused by a school principal, and she ended up taking a case all the way to the European Court of Human Rights, where it was found that the Irish government had failed in its obligation to protect children in national schools. At the time that case came through, we had about 30 people who had been abused in similar circumstances being supported by 1 in 4. And there was a certain sense of satisfaction that now these cases could proceed and that it would be possible for these people to get compensation from the state. We really regret the view that the Department of Education has taken, who are interpreting that judgment in an incredibly narrow way, which will exclude most of the victims. We estimate in total there's probably about 200 survivors involved. So we're not talking about huge numbers, huge money, and we really wish that the Department of Education would operate not necessarily in the very narrow way that they've done, but in the spirit of that judgment. The Victims' Rights Alliance is an amalgamation of NGOs working with victims of crime, everything from homicide to traffic offences to sexual offences, domestic violence and so on, and 1 in 4 is a very active member of that. We really welcome in 2015 the arrival of the EU Directive on Victims' Rights, and we know the Minister is working on the victims' rights legislation, which will transpose that into Irish law. But already we can see that the criminal justice agencies are working very hard to develop a much more victim-focused way of working with victims of crime that may perhaps make it easier, we would hope, for victims of crime to actually access the criminal justice system. We've also been very active providing training courses to professionals all around the country, particularly in relation to the impact of mandatory reporting on the counselling relationship. And we have been delighted to be invited to present papers about our work at conferences here in Ireland, but also internationally. Last year we presented papers in Budapest, in Copenhagen, in Athens and in Pennsylvania. I should quickly say that these were funded by the conference holders, not by us. We wouldn't be able to do that. Finally, I was delighted to see in the budget yesterday that the Minister for Justice is making an extra €250,000 available to the Commission for Support to Victims of Crime, which I hope some of us will trickle down our way, all in due time. I am very grateful to all the people who have supported us. We get about 65% of our funding between the HSE and the Commission of Victims of Crime, and we really are very grateful for that solid support, which has stabilised over the last year or two. But we are highly dependent on the generosity of private funders and donors. Everybody from the person who gives us €5 a month during the year to people who make very, very substantial donations. I'd like to thank all the companies who sponsor a day at 1 in 4. It costs €2,211 to run 1 in 4 for a day, and lots of small and medium-sized companies have actually become involved in that sponsorship. I'd like to thank our board for their endless support and generosity with their time and their expertise. And I'd also like to thank our staff who have worked through a number of years of very difficult circumstances. We've had cutbacks, we've taken unpaid leave, we've had salary deductions, and yet people have always gone that extra mile so that our clients didn't suffer. So thank you very much, and I'll pass it over to the Minister.